Welcome to Scoutcast, Roasting Marshmallows, with your host, Selfassured.
Welcome everyone to the Four Scouts podcast. My name is Selfassured and I will be your host for today's podcast. I'm joined today by my colleagues Henk and Arno, and today we'll be talking about the most heard excuses in the software engineering industry. But not only that, they may have also heard a lot of excuses in their real life as well. So let me introduce my guests. So first we have Henk Santana de Miranda. Welcome to the podcast, and can you introduce yourself to our listener?
Hi, well, as Rolf tried to pronounce my name, is Henk. I'm actually from Brazil. Moved in Holland back in 2010, the mid of the World Cup, when actually Brazil lost against the Netherlands with that tiny Snyder.
Yeah, man.
I do have a developer background. Yes, very much. It's still hunting me. I do have a developer background, and I'm mostly focusing on right now coaching organizations and helping teams to transform. That's a bit about me.
All right. Well, nice to have you here. So my next guest is Arno van Rossum. Could you also introduce yourself to our listeners, Arno?
Yes. Hello. I'm Arno. I'm living in near Utrecht. Working in software development for at least 15 years. I help teams transform to Agile and help implement CI/CD, or continuous integration, continuous deployment.
All right. Welcome again, guys. I'm really excited having you here. So, as I mentioned, the subject for today is the most heard excuses you guys have encountered in your professional experience, but also in real life. Considering the experience you guys have, I'm sure it's going to be a very long list. So let's get right into it. So, Arno, could you maybe kick it off by giving us an example of a most heard excuse?
Yes. One of the excuses we hear quite a lot is there's no time to write automated tests, at least in software development. Mm-hmm. We hear it everywhere with job interviews or clients we go to, and it's always the same excuses.
And why is it an excuse to write a test? Like, do you need a test?
Well, from my perspective, yes. There are various reasons for that. I think one perspective is you should validate the stuff you actually wrote, so you know what's intended to do. It actually does. So That's for me one of the most important aspects of it.
Yeah, and I think also one aspect of it that the teams or people don't really think about it is that they spend a lot of time fixing bug, and then they think that time is actually somehow magically appears to them, that they think like, oh, I have no time for tests, but they actually spend 2-3 days trying to fix a bug that could have been avoided by writing a simple test that would take maybe 2 hours or 3 hours.
And if you put that argument forward, like, okay, how much time does it take you to fix a bug then, and do you have time for that? What's the typical response?
Well, the typical response is actually they say it is faster to just fix the bug.
Really?
But they actually do not really know. They never really measure. And if we actually measure that, you can see that it gets a surprise for them once you actually enlighten them with the time difference they actually take to fix it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Plus the benefit of having a more stable production. Because in the end, if your code fails and your test could have covered it, then production works.
Yeah.
But if you're just fixing bugs, then bugs are in production and your customer might suffer from it.
Exactly. And Arno, you mentioned about validating your code. Is that a technical validation, or is that more of a functionality type validation, or how should I see that?
It could actually be both, I guess. From security perspective, you could validate if your security is still up to par. Mm-hmm. That's one part, but I think the most important part for me anyways is actually validating your business requirements.
Exactly.
That they are still the way they should be. So one of the benefits could be like after 4 years after writing a test, a new developer comes in and might break something he didn't know. Well, the test should cover it and at least explain to the new developer what the original business request was.
Yeah, so in your perspective, a test has business value then. It's not just a technical exercise to like fix or to get a ticket to the status done, but it's really something that is part of the business requirements.
Yeah, for me it is. I think it's,
I definitely
the most
agree with
important
that
thing.
view.
Have you guys ever seen where the business then actively prevented someone from writing a test because they thought, well, maybe they can build some other functionality or feature from me real quick? Like trying to trade the time?
I definitely heard developers using that as an excuse for not writing tests, but I honestly never saw any manager or leader, team lead say, no, you're not going to write tests because this is irrelevant.
Right. So the developer thinks the business is preventing them.
Yeah, it's an imaginary thing, yes.
I actually have a bit of a different experience. I actually have to sell it a few times to the business to why we actually do this.
Okay.
Because they actually have the feeling we needed to do more functionality instead of writing tests.
But then you were spending too much time writing tests in hindsight, or was it just like the time to build a feature from end to end took too long, or why?
Well, on the moment you actually educate the team, like how to write a test and what it actually does, for them, time to add functionality goes up a bit, I guess. And that's where the questions come from as well. Because they say we never have time to write automated tests or test at all. Then they go to the business, do we actually, well, they request for that time. And then they want to know why you want more time to actually do the test. So yes, we actually have to sell it sometimes.
Okay.
But I never had a problem that they said no.
Okay, that's interesting. And why is automated test better? Why can't they just do a manual test? What's the difference?
Well, I think the main difference is that a manual test is going to grow, right? The amount of tests, as the application grows, the functionality grows, the complexity grows. Then you're going to have to add more people to the problem. And then eventually it's going to be done by a human being, and they all make mistakes. And it's quite hard to not make mistakes in repetitive work. So if you have to test the whole system, and then as the system grows, becomes much harder to validate that everything works every time.
Yeah.
And then you're going to have to rely on the developers by saying, wow, I'm pretty sure I did not touch that part of the system. Well, that's not how it works. And that's the dangers of having manual tests.
Yeah.
And I think the most important thing about the manual testing is that it kind of adds more people to the team, like testers and QA engineers that hope to basically get the mistake that the developers are actually making it, and then replaces the responsibility of the person who actually built the functionality should be the same person who actually builds it.
Yeah.
So it becomes kind of like can become a dysfunction. Yes.
It could encourage silos, right? I mean, you build a functionality and you throw it over the fence and then hope some other guy catches your mistakes. And
correct. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
And in your opinion, how does it work then if you have multiple teams? Let's say you both touch the same flow or business process. How does it work with the testing then?
What you mean with the same flow?
Well, let's say you have a large company and you have multiple teams, might be working in the same bounded context. How does it work then when you don't have a manual tester? How do you...
Well, I think you have different
teams?
ways, like you have different type of testing that you can automate that it can make sure that this doesn't happen. So let's just say that, let's say two teams, they are supposed to be on the same context and they have to communicate with each other, right? So you can write sort of like contract testings, integration testing between those two, that it will make sure that if one breaks the other one get notified. So there is a few different approaches that you can take to make sure that this is also automated. The question is always going to be, okay, who responsibility is of doing what? And and I think that's always the magic. You need to have a conversation about it.
Yeah. Okay. And what about testing environments, for example? Is everyone always, in your opinion, able to write an automated test, even if they had the time and the know-how on how to do it? Like, is it always possible in your experience? Or do they sometimes have like certain external factors where it just was not possible? I don't know. What do you think?
Well, personally, I think there's no proper test environment is not necessarily a problem. Because in my opinion, the automated test should run in your pipeline in the form of continuous integration. And even having a test environment, if everything is automated, you could say you don't need it at all.
Okay.
I agree.
Okay. All right. Well, I think this first excuse we elaborated on enough. Unless you guys have something to add, otherwise, I think we can.
I think what I could just add to the subject is like indeed an excuse like no time for test. I don't think it's a valid excuse. I think it's more about people do not know how to do it or they heard about it, and I think that's totally fine. But I think the excuse should be phrased different, like, wow, I have never done it, I don't have the experience, and that's why we never did it.
Yeah.
Not per se finding reasons like no time, right? We all know that it's not about time, it's about priorities.
Exactly. They never
Not even that.
Yeah.
I think even for a developer, it should be part of the way you work.
Correct.
For me, it's the same as saying a doctor doesn't wash his hands before a surgery. It just doesn't make sense.
Because he has no time, right?
Because he has no time.
There's no time to wash his hands or to stitch the patient back together.
Yeah.
Yeah, it makes sense, definitely. And I had one more question about this, because sometimes developers can be really self-assured about their work. I wouldn't say arrogant, but they're definitely confident in their abilities, and they maybe say like, I don't need to write tests, I just know my stuff works. Have you guys ever seen something like that? Because I definitely have.
Yes, and I also actually heard very recently from a friend who is just joined a new company, and his lead developer is exactly saying the same thing, and he is like, wow, what should I say to this guy, right?
Yeah.
Because he's so confident. And I think it's quite simple. It's not about that person per se, in my point of view, it's about the team. And eventually this guy is going to leave. And let's say maybe he doesn't make any mistake. Wow, the next day if he gets sick or if he's on holiday, some people is going to need to modify his code or maintain his code. And he should do it for the others, not for himself.
Yeah.
And of course for the company and for the customers that he is serving. Because even if he is perfect, some other people eventually will have to touch his legacy, and that's when things breaks.
Yeah, I 100% agree. All right. So, Henk, do you have a new, most heard excuse for us that you've encountered?
Yeah, so I think not only per se on developers, but I think that's this excuse I heard as well with product owners or managers or either like the C-level when we present a new thing for them. And we ask questions, the most heard excuses, that is just how we work. You just have to accept that.
Yeah.
Like this is never going to work here because this is just how we work. I think this is quite a common excuse.
And that's interesting, right? Because they may hire you to help them perform certain changes or like to improve, and then one of the first feedbacks you get is, well, it's not going to work because we work this and that. So that is kind of contradictory to me, but yeah, it's interesting. So so how does it manifest itself? Do they actually actively ignore advice or?
Yeah, so I have an example of this customer who we basically said, wow, we would like to visualize work. We'd like to see how your work is going around. And Kanban is a tool that can actually do that. And then his answer was, well, we tried Kanban, but that didn't work for us because we could not, we just saw a lot of tasks being blocked on the way. So this is how it works. So they cannot see that the Kanban is actually to help them to visualize their work and that they actually have bottlenecks. And they basically say, wow, this did not fit to the way how we work, even though the way how they are working is not optimal for what they are trying to achieve.
Yeah, so it made clear to them that a lot of stuff gets stuck for a long time, and then they said, well, because it's stuck for a long time, Kanban is not for us. Instead, they should they should have reversed the thought, but they actually thought wow, this doesn't work for us because so that's one thing that I found it really interesting. And is that maybe because they just because they've been working like that for years and years? Is it just because they like the stability and the pattern? They know the patterns and they know how their days at their work is going to look like, and are they maybe scared of changing that around?
I believe so. Yes, I think that would be my belief as well. That they are just used to it, and that's comfortable. And if you are comfortable, yeah, why change, right?
Exactly.
And I have a question about that as well. Is it something that some people just don't decide on? For example, don't have the mandate to actually change that behavior?
I think it can be as well, but I think mostly is about you hear things like, yeah, the company doesn't allow, right? But the company per se doesn't exist. It's like a person behind, some group of people who would make such a decision. And a lot of those they take for granted in the past. Maybe 5 years ago, somebody said this is not allowed, and then they just carry this message, but it was never reinforced, or it was actually never a rule. So I don't per se think it is because they cannot do it. It's more about indeed it's just what they are comfortable with, and they have this perceived boundaries that doesn't allow them to do better or try to change the way how they work.
And Arno mentioned something about a mandate, but you cannot really just tell people to work in a different way, right? You have to show them, and hopefully they'll adopt better ways of working. I don't think you can just say like, hey, you have to use Kanban now because it's going to fix your problems. How you guys would approach breaking these patterns?
Well, I do have some experience with having a mandate with a team of around 10 to 14 people. And I actually just used my mandate to force some rules.
Okay.
Because the leading by example, well, then you have to take time for that to show them the way. But if you have a lot of people, it also gets harder to show them the way because it goes really slow. So sometimes it's also easier just to put some, well, rules in place to let them see them for themselves.
Yeah,
Okay.
but I guess
So
in your example also meant, if I remember as well, that means a lot of people will not like it or adopt it, and they will make a decision to leave, right? It's not like you're gonna get everybody on board with the mandate.
I agree on that.
And is that acceptable for these companies, that some people will just say like, I just cannot adhere to this style of working and I'm going to resign? Is that an acceptable loss?
Well, it depends. I think the rules in place shouldn't be that much. It's also to guide them some way, and eventually the rules should go away and let them figure it out for themselves. But in the moment of the rule, if they actually have a problem with that, you should have an open discussion on it and what you're trying to achieve.
Yeah.
And if they still resign, either the message is incorrect, or they don't understand it, or they really don't like it.
Yeah, but I think even with a mandate, definitely an explanation of the why those things are there. It's always, of course, welcoming, right? It's like, it's not because, well, you have a mandate that you should just say, well, you're gonna do A, B, and C, and you don't deserve an explanation. And I think the two things are very important to make a distinction.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's true.
And very related to that is just how we work here is also an excuse that I've encountered, at least, is that people will just say like, well, this is never going to work for our company. So instead of trying to stick to something and then you try to introduce change, they'll say like, yeah, this is not going to work here. Have you guys ever heard that excuse as well?
Actually, quite a lot. I think it's one every new customer we go through we hear, and it's usually the same things. Moving code to production 50 times a day. People are always scared about that one.
Yeah, because they always go to production like once a month or something, or even worse, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Definitely. And I think another one that I think scares people is about actually transparency, right? And when we say that we wanted to basically get people to talk about their frustrations and their feelings, and they all say, wow, nobody's going to open up. Nobody's going to say anything. Everybody's afraid of this person. Everybody's afraid of doing that. So no, that's not going to work here.
And then you do get them to open up, or how do you get them to how do you break the ice, so to say? Is that by going to production, or is that by being more open and relatable and just having the conversation?
I think there is a series of actions, that are taking place for that. So I guess we're talking about on the part of building trust, and it is definitely happens with one-on-one conversations, trying to figure out what is the minimum thing you can do to show progress, and basically having a group discussion where you facilitate conversations around polemics or controversial topics, and basically people start to see that actually it's okay to disagree with each other, it's okay to have a healthy conflict, and then and all those three steps together, I believe that actually helps to build the trust and end up helping this change to actually become successful.
And then if the trust is built up, that will ultimately result in a better product or in a better work environment, or what's the net result?
Definitely in a better team, and the hope is that the better team will figure out the better product, or they will be able to grow together and fix themselves their own problems.
Yeah,
because that's the end result. You wanted to have an autonomous team that are able to continuously learn and continuously improve and adjust based on the problems that will always appear.
Yeah.
And not just that, every team member should be listened to as well.
Yeah.
And not one idea from above somewhere that states we should go to somewhere. And that's the end goal.
And I think now on the top of that, right, like I've also had experienced some retrospective in other companies, and normally they just address the process. They never address what Arno just said, right? People also has feelings, people also have emotions. And I think a team, to become a team, they need to be transparent with those as well. And they should not make a split between work and emotions, right? In the end, you spend most of your time at work.
Yeah.
So it is always going to be personal.
So do you think that during these retrospectives you should just like mention names? Like, oh, I think Enrique, was a bit off this week, or how would I see that in the retrospective?
I think at some point, yes. Depends on the level of trust that the team has it. But I would definitely check up front with the person. Hey, would you mind if I mention your name?
Okay.
And if they would say yes, I would definitely bring it to the light, and I would definitely mention their names to try to show that it is okay.
Yeah.
And probably I would bring an example of myself first, and then try to bring other people with me on the equation.
Yeah. Okay, interesting. So do you guys have anything more, like any more excuses that you want to touch upon?
I think there is one that is also quite interesting, is that like management, or normally they always say, well, IT is the bottleneck. It's the perception that the team, the developers, they do not deliver. This is just like somehow the status quo, like IT never delivers.
And that is based upon long times of delivering functionality, or just having a lot of bugs or dissatisfied customers, or how do they come to this conclusion that is the development team's problem?
Well, I actually think one of the core issues... Sorry to intervene.
No, go ahead, man.
I think one of the biggest issues is that I sometimes agree with them. The development team doesn't deliver. And the reason usually is because they don't deliver to production. They just build something next to it and work on that for 2 years in a shed, and then hope for the best that it works. Yeah, if I was the business waiting for 2 or 3 years on my product, I wouldn't be happy as well.
Yeah. And then after 2 years, releasing some code to production is like launching a space shuttle, I guess. It's super hard. Yeah. Do you share that opinion, Henk? That it is a development team problem?
I think it's a combination, right? I don't see IT and business being two different things, but it's more like I think another metric that they consider for IT never deliver is because they say yes for every requirement and feature and functionality that the customer wants, and basically have this endless backlog that keeps growing endless. And then every time they look at the backlog, because they say, wow, that's the business responsibility. I'm using the word business, but some people will product owners or product managers. and that list keeps growing, right? So basically, the sense and the feeling is always like, wow, we're never gonna be done with this, and then they blame on the other side for not doing fast enough.
Yeah.
And I think that's also the wrong way of seeing the problem, because let's assume that even if the developers are doing this continuous delivery, continuous deployments, and sending every functionality, but the backlogs keep growing, and that's your measurement of, wow, IT never delivers, sensation, then I think it's definitely misplaced the equation. But I agree with Arno as well that it's because developers, they keep holding the code because they don't go to production fast enough, because they don't have time for testing, and because they don't have all the excuses we basically previously said, makes the problem become much bigger, what creates the silo between IT and business.
And how would you change this perception around? Is it also by just, going to production more often, or would you search, more of a try to connect the business and development together? Maybe, integrate some of these guys into the team, or what would be your approach? I know. Do you have an approach? I mean, if there is not an approach, that's fine as well, of course. I'm just curious if you have a solution.
Well, I think the first thing is you should measure it somehow, right? If you don't measure anything, you don't know if the team actually delivers or not. And one of the problems I see personally is that they measure on the number of tickets they push through sprint or Kanban or week, or doesn't really matter. And the problem with that, if you measure on just that, people will actually start to inflate the stories or just build smaller ones or move them around or think of ways to actually improve the speed of the stories going through and not the actual outcome of what the story should be.
Yeah. So basically we're saying they are like, if I would compare with like Scrum, it's more like they are calculating story points and they are calculating their velocities, and then in the end nothing gets deployed to production, but their velocity is extremely high, and then they explain to business, our velocity is, 40, so we are doing great, but yet there is no production, actually customer being satisfied, and they are basically measuring output rather than outcome.
Or even could be that they do deploy the production but don't have any customers. So you should actually track back to your previous stories, are they actually useful or not? Maybe nobody wants them, so why keep them?
So you're saying the solution for this problem would be not only deploy very often to production, but make sure that your customers are actually using it. That's how this problem could be solved. Yeah.
So that you know that you are actually delivering the functionality that people are requesting, rather than what business might think is needed, but what's actually needed.
And having the proper metrics with that.
Yeah.
Maybe something on sales instead of number of stories a sprint.
Yeah, so I think the way how I also the way how I look at this metric as well, I think it's related to, for example, if you are trying to lose weight or something and you measure your BMI, right? It is a metric that on its own, it doesn't mean anything. It's just an indication that you either might be overweight or you might be underweight, but you have no information about how much muscles do you have, how much fat percentage did you lose, and then in the end of the day you are measuring the easiest thing because you don't need much to get that measurement, but in the end it does not give the result that you actually want. And I think that's the part of, let's say, just counting the stories that you deliver every week, but you don't know what your customer is using, how often they are using. You just have the easiest metric, but yet it's not solving your problem.
So it's artificial numbers, and like Arno said, the team is going to inflate them, and you're going to improve your velocity, but it's just going to be in the numbers. Yeah, you definitely see that. You see that a lot. All right, so moving on, there's one that I would like to bring into the mix, because most of the customers that I've been to at least have had a lot of legacy software where the developers just could not improve upon it or refactor it or do anything with it because it's just so old and written by guys who haven't worked there anymore or who haven't worked there in a long time anymore. and they just don't dare to touch the code. They can't do any meaningful improvement to it, and it's still generating money. There's still customers using it, so they're kind of stuck into something. Have you guys ever seen something like that as well? And have they used that?
Yes.
Have they used that as an excuse not to try and improve the situation?
Yes. I actually did a few times, more often than I would like to, but I think it's also like, the IT industry is, I think, filled with those.
Mm-hmm.
I think this excuse is also very much related to lack of knowledge or lack of experience of how to dealing with it.
Mm-hmm.
But you can find definitely several books that can actually teach you technique of how to deal with those type of application. And I think that problem is very much related to just experience with writing proper testing and try to get better at it.
Yeah.
Not just that, I think the whole steps people miss again in this one is actually moving to production way more often, even with your legacy system. I think it's even more important there. So let's say you go 50 times a day. If you make a minor change, you know what you changed. And if you have your monitoring up to par, which is quite possible with your legacy,
Mm-hmm.
you could actually see pretty quick what you messed up.
Yeah.
So the safety net, yes, that's an issue, but then again, you could move really fast on it.
And how do you deal with the people who says like, wow, but I don't have the confidence enough that this is gonna work. Like if I do this every day, I'm gonna break my customers every day, several times a day.
But then it's the question, what is worse? Breaking it several times a day with a small problem, or once a month where you're down for a few days?
Yeah, that's
So
a good
from my
conversation.
perspective, I think it's always a minor problem is better than a big problem a long time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And from the other side, I've never seen a legacy system so far which you cannot test. Of course, you have to make some adjustments to it, but most of it is at least a bit testable.
Okay.
Yeah, so you have different techniques that you can apply, right?
Yes.
But the most like the whole advice is basically just try to get it under control, get some experience with it, and try and be able to do small changes, and then you can work towards gaining confidence into the source code. All right,
This is
interesting.
where the big pitfall usually is. That's where people put the system next to it and try to move it or as a migration at once.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think that's gonna work.
They try to like rebuild it with new software, and they try to emulate the old behavior, which is never going to work because they have no idea what's in there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And nobody knows that.
Exactly. Yeah. Okay, so do you guys have more for me? A lot of heard excuses, maybe customer related or size related. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, I think we have at least one more. I think we cannot do like, so Arno is talking about a lot of this push into production very often.
Mm-hmm.
And we call that, there is a term in the market called continuous deployment. And basically they say we cannot do continuous deployment because we have a very low test coverage.
Okay.
So that is the reason why we cannot do that. So I think this is a really quite modern, I think, reasons or excuse, but it's becoming very much now hitting every single customer we go to.
Mm-hmm. So
because they actually agree with the idea now, they just trying to find an excuse for not doing it.
Yeah, and they have continuous integration a lot of the time because that's pretty easy, right? You just compile the code and build something, and you just park it somewhere. But the real challenge is getting it to production, and that is the deployment part of it, right?
Yeah.
And why is it that they think that the low test coverage is the main barrier? Is it because they feel that it breaks if they have too low test coverage? It's gonna break on them, even if the test coverage is low. If they manual deploy it, I mean, the test coverage is not gonna change between a automated deployment every commit versus a manual deployment every other month or week, right?
No, correct. But I think they come from a place where they basically, before going to production, they have a set of manual tests.
Okay.
And then if you say, wow, if you commit your code 20 times a day, you would need 20 times this manual test that takes 3 days to repeat every time. Is just not possible. So it's more like they keep with the old mindset of going to production once a month with 3 days or a week of manual testing.
Yeah.
And then when you say, wow, we should go to production every time, they do not change the way how they think. They just keep thinking the same way. Like, so that means I have to test now like crazy. And that's the part of the, I guess, in the beginning of the conversation, right? It's like Arno had a mandate, so he could basically say, wow, we're going to do this. And then everybody has to follow. And I think that forces, in a way, in a positive scenario, to change the way how people behave. That will eventually change the way how they see the problem. And I think that's very important as well.
And I think it's also a reason that people are just scared of it. They are just scared of moving to production so often that they give the reason of its low test coverage.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think I have, in a way, like I use this excuse in a different scenario. So I do like a sport climbing for a hobby.
Yeah.
And I'm also like into, let's say, weightlifting or let's say getting my body in shape. But because climbing is my main hobby, I always find a reason to not do weightlift because I say like, but then I'm going to have muscle pain, so I'm not going to perform well. Yeah. But then if I just do the weightlift enough, I will never get that muscle pain. But if I just do once every 2 weeks, I always have the muscle pain, right? So it's also a bit unconscious that we use this excuse several places in our life. And I do this every week and I'm like, oh, I know that, but yet it's still there.
Yeah, that's cool. Do you have anything to add on that, Arno?
No, but I like the story.
Yeah, man. It's a pretty good story. Well, I mean, you like to ride your bicycle, I understood. Do you have a similar experience with that? Bicycle versus skates?
No, I like both, so I don't skip them.
Okay, it's not like, oh man, if I ride my bike now, I cannot skate tomorrow. It's not, you don't have that kind of, okay.
And do you
different muscle groups, so it works.
I like to weightlift as well a lot. And if I know that I, for example, go on a Saturday, if I plan like maybe remodeling the house or painting or something, I'm not going to train certain body parts like the day or 2 days before of it, because then I also know like, I'm going to have a muscle ache and it's just going to be uncomfortable doing these things. But it's a pretty lame excuse, because even with muscle aches, I can, mow the lawn or, paint a wall. It's just kind of uncomfortable. So I have these excuses to myself as well, no doubt. Yeah.
So it's a bit of laziness in the end.
Yeah, you just, like as a human being, I feel that we are all wired to make it as easy for ourselves as possible. And, hearing your experiences with work, I think we also try to apply this mindset to work, right? Like, how can I be most, this is the path of the least resistance. And you just see that all the time.
And I guess that's the part that it makes it hard, right? Because it's just counterintuitive. Basically, if we actually do this, it's actually better for us, but yet we don't do it. And then it takes time to realize that.
Exactly, because with, going to production more often, you also incur the pain more often, and then we just have a natural response of like, oh, I don't want this. But the whole end goal is, of course, to take away the pain in the end. But exactly. It's a process. All right, well, I think that wraps it up. Did any of these excuses apply to you or your company? I'm sure some of them did, because they sure did for me. If you're curious about how we can help to take these excuses away, then feel free to contact us through our website, which is forscouts.nl, or send an email to podcast@forscouts.nl. You can also use that email address if you have any tips or subjects for us to talk about. And please get in touch. We also have a Twitter handle, which is forscouts. So if you want to use that to get into contact, that's also great. All right, I want to thank my guests, Arno and Hiek. Thank you very much for joining me. I had a good time.
Thank you.
And thanks for listening, and I'll see you guys in the next podcast.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode of Scoutcast, Roasting Marshmallows, with your host, Rolf Surd. For more great content and to stay up to date, visit forscouts.nl. and on Twitter @4Scouts. If you enjoyed today's episode, please leave a review and subscribe, and we'll catch you next time on Scoutcast, Roasting Marshmallows.